Right, okay. Are you seeing my screen?
Yeah, we're fine. Yeah. Hope everybody can see that okay. And you introduced this idea of the use of the word wicked, which I didn't get.
Well, I was surprised you hadn't heard this term, Chris. So I
Not in
quickly
this
looked.
context, no.
I think somebody used it. Well, we were conversing with a professor for that article you mentioned, the putting timber into context of construction, and it was a sort of landscape specialist, somebody who was trying to understand how climate change is affecting landscapes. At the same time, we're trying to ensure that the health of carbon sinks and ecosystems are sort of working with us rather than against us. And he described something as a wicked problem, so I looked it up. And climate change itself is a wicked problem. And the definition is nice and clear here. Wicked problem is a social or cultural problem, particularly tonight. Building is a cultural activity that's difficult or impossible to solve. Let's go with difficult, shall we? Normally because of its complex and interconnected nature. Wicked problems lack clarity in both their aims and solutions and are subject to real-world constraints which hinder risk-free attempts to find a solution. I think that that kind of describes retrofit for me. Certainly after doing this work that I'm going to talk about tonight, which is just initial work rising to a challenge that's been made about deep retrofit. I keep going into these sort of little panics about things and ring people up and say, what does this mean? How do I make sense of this? And I'm doing that because it is a wicked problem that we're faced with, many wicked problems. So what I'm going to do, I've got, I think it's 29 slides, 30 slides, and there are rather more graphs than I've been allowed to use in the past. Now, some of the graphs are just context setting. Matthew's got his start because he likes graphs, and I like graphs, but I like them because I've had a chance to sort of look at them and choose them and try to understand what they're saying. Now, you're not going to have that tonight. You will be able to see the presentation in your own time, but I think there's a series of graphs about the bigger picture, and then we're going to sort of focus down to the to the UK, and then we're going to look specifically at building, and then specifically at space heating homes rather than any other aspect of them. So I'm going to, if I go a bit fast, forgive me through this first set. I just want to get to what I'm calling the holy grail graph that I was driving Tim to please make this graph for me. Tim, can you please express carbon and operational energy and give me this graph which says everything? And I feel we've got a very interesting graph that tells a lot of stories at the end of this sequence, and it's that I think will pose a lot of questions. I'm going to try and make as much space for Q&A at the end as possible. It means I'm going to go faster through this first bit. So I've put this one up here because this is the world. This is CO2 emissions by fuel type, and it's just a reminder really of we've been talking a lot about gas, about natural gas, fossil fuel gas, methane. And what this is showing is what fossil fuels use, what fossil fuels the world is burning, and what we're seeing and hoping is going to continue is that coal is peaking. Coal use is peaking. We hope it won't experience a resurgence in the future. Oil potentially peaking, gas, not sure. But it's just interesting seeing the proportions of fossil fuels used on a global basis. And obviously we start to get a sense of the magnitude of things. So we're going to be talking in billions, millions, gigawatts, terawatts. What I was hoping to start the presentation with, I couldn't find it, is a way to make kilowatts and terawatts sort of understandable, in your gut. How do you understand what a terawatt is? My default go-to understanding of a kilowatt is, and I'm old enough to remember this, a 2-bar electric fire, the ones used to turn on and 2 little rods glowed red hot. But a lot of people don't know what those are. So 1 kilowatt was 1 bar, 2 kilowatts is 2 bars. You've got a real feel for it. But I can't get my head around terawatts. Maybe you can. Okay. Fossil fuel consumption. So this is just sort of looking at a number of the larger countries and our place in that. So who's using most fossil fuels, and you can and which direction are they going in? So you can see, of course, China, very large country, high population. You can see the United States there leveling off in its use of fossil fuels. You can see India increasing. You can see Russia kind of levelish. Africa, large continent, increasing. And then we get to the sort of, smaller countries, smaller populations, Germany, United Kingdom, France, and Ireland, and so on. Just starts to give you a sense of perspective of where the fossil fuels are being burned. So focusing in a bit closer, countries a bit closer to home, we can see ourselves in comparison to Germany, which is of course always interesting. And then you can see the smaller countries, the Scandinavian countries with stronger social policies and perhaps more access to, well, a bit more foresight, but also hydropower and stuff like that down the bottom. And I've included things like places like Sweden and Norway. Norway is interesting because, of course, they sell us electricity. And there's going to be some more interconnectivity between, and there is already increasing interconnectivity in electricity supply between Norway and Britain. Okay, so cumulative. So this is, I just put this in really as a way to help us read graphs at speed. One of the holy grail graphs at the end is a cumulative carbon graph, and the other is an annual graph. So cumulative graphs, basically what you're looking for there, if we're trying to reduce our carbon emissions, it's the amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that build up in the atmosphere, the cumulative greenhouse gases or cumulative carbon in the atmosphere that will define how catastrophic climate change is ultimately. So when we're looking at graphs like this, cumulative carbon graphs, what we're looking for is it to level out. If it's going to, if it starts diminishing, we're actually reducing the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which if we left, if we reduce the population drastically or energy use way down very rapidly and increased carbon sinks dramatically, a graph like that would start to fall. I've also pulled out that it's interesting, about 1900, Britain was leading. It was leading in cumulative CO2 emissions. You can see from that little sort of box out there. And it was around about 1910 that America, I think, the United States overtook us, but you can see the European countries in around 1900 were basically catching up in terms of cumulative CO2 emissions. But that's all of the European countries, and that's just Britain as a single country. And you can see China way down there. Okay, so retrofit, the wicked problem. So I think 10 or so years ago, we were, maybe a bit longer, we were thinking about retrofit, knowing about buildings, AECB membership, knowing about buildings, thinking about it as a sort of something that we should be tackling because of climate change. And I think over the years, we've realized that it's much more complex than just another sort of climate change policy, reduce greenhouse gas emissions from buildings. So the components of this problem are the homes themselves, the actual building, by which I mean the way it's built, cavity wall construction, solid wall construction, new precast concrete forms of construction and so on. That also includes the shape of the building, the way they go together, terraced houses or individual houses or flats or so on. Then there's the question of modeling these buildings as part of the process of understanding, identifying measures, and trying to assess the benefit of measures and the cost benefit aspect of measures. So within each of these areas, there are huge problems, skill gaps, a lack of understanding, a kind of persistent ignorance about buildings, which is remarkable, persisting over so many years, a lack of understanding about how the buildings perform before and after retrofit, meaning that we're flying blind, that we don't actually know what we're doing, whether it works that well, or where could it be improved. Flying blind is a good metaphor for that. There's the issue of how do we sensibly think about risk, because everything contains risk, nothing's risk-free. And then there's the question of the measures themselves. What are the measures? Well, insulation, their air tightness tapes, their new windows, their ventilation and heating systems. And there are lots of issues coming out of that as well. You know, supply problems, supply and demand constraints, the embodied upfront carbon emissions from some building materials being more than others, and so on. And just the logistics of getting them onto buildings with people living in the buildings. And then there's the sort of design side. Now, Matthew mentioned the one-stop shop concept, which in Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland, with their retrofit program. So as I understand it, the one-stop shop is this part where the energy modeling and the design work happens. These diagrams you're seeing on the screen here actually details and strategies developed for archetypes. So in this particular case, this building here was chosen to represent a bunch of archetypes. It's a semi-detached house type with some particular characteristics. And then within that, there are some number of variations, but the details and the strategies and the measures themselves could be applied across this group, even though there were some slight variations. And I'm imagining that the Irish one-stop shop do all of that work probably on a similar basis. They may be doing individual homes. They may be starting to develop archetype approaches to producing this information, but it's funded. Now, of course, you know, this is a really important stage that needs resources. It needs skills, time. It needs people need paying to do quite a lot of work at this stage. So where's that happening in retrofit? And then there's more thermal modeling of individual components. So PAS 2035, for example, contains some requirements to make sure that particular parts of the building aren't going to suffer undue condensation, and there's some thermal modeling associated with that. And then, of course, across all of this, there's the money, the capital cost, the operational costs, any finance costs, grants, and so on. And the situation we seem to be in is that the capital cost of effective deep retrofit is consistently understated. The Committee on Climate Change have known that for a while. They've got some experience of eco measures, which are individual measures, and they've understood whole house retrofit by simply listing all the eco measures. And what that misses out is that the connection between wall and roof insulation and so on carries a cost. Air tightness measures aren't properly factored in and so on. So there's still a poor understanding of cost, and it's usually underestimated. We all want to move to get efficiencies of scale, so costs come down, but we're quite a long way from that at the moment. Although Duncan Smith, the new AECB External Affairs Director, has a lot of experience in this area, and he's been starting to educate me about projects, particularly coming out of Renfrewshire, who've been pioneering retrofits, where they are seeing, he's assuring me they are seeing some economic benefits from scaled retrofit. And then more detailing sometimes. This is the bit I actually really enjoy. It's a wicked problem. It's a complete pain in the arse, but this is really technically interesting stuff. And certainly the work we were doing on this particular project, it throws up some interesting opportunities. How do you deal with bay windows? How do you insulate them in ways that avoid you having to go into the property? And how do you do it in a way that increases air tightness and so on? So very technically challenging. And it throws up innovation. So this is an external air tightness wrap. Some hydrothermal modeling showed that it's robust. And theoretically, this isn't probably what they're going to do. But potentially, you know, we can be generating libraries of ways of doing things, which will really sort of unlock making this a lot easier, basically. Okay, right. I'm going to check the time. There we go. I'm going to talk about energy before we go into carbon. I'm going to talk about energy and trying to, and also this is bringing in the idea of carbon budgets, personal budgets, household budgets. What is an average budget when the carbon emissions of the top 10%, wealthiest people globally, the Oxfam report, shows that 50% of the emissions are a result of those top 10%. So the emissions are very skewed. So when we talk about personal carbon budgets and averages, it's very skewed to that top 10%. So Retrofit is working in the able to pay market, trying to encourage those top 10% wealthy earners. There's a lot of room for them bringing their emissions, even down to the European average. Kevin Anderson is very clear, that people in that group should be bringing. We're not asking them to wear hair shirts. We're just asking them to bring their energy use, their lifestyles down to the European average, which is a pretty good lifestyle. But there we go. Now, I've put this up because this is an initiative that's been kicking around for years. It's called the 2000 Watt Society. I don't know, it's an idea, it's a policy idea, which is currently apparently being implemented in Zurich, where they had a referendum and decided they were going to give it a go. And I've always tried to get some hard facts. What is the 2000 Watt Society? So I've got a lot of windows in the way of my slide. Let me just move that. What this seems to represent is it's a policy coming out of Switzerland that is very focused on reducing energy use and then decarbonising lots of that. So rather than the idea of just planning to sort of produce lots more energy, and it's all decarbonised, which is potentially very expensive and potentially undoable. This model has focused on reducing energy use, and they seem to have a very clear, strong belief that in sufficiency, so that what they're saying is you can lead a modern, rounded, very nice life by reducing your energy use, and then by decarbonising. What they're saying is about 75% of this energy target per person to bring you to about the 1 ton carbon lifestyle. So you can live your whole life without emitting more than 1 ton of CO2 per year, which, as we know from various people's experiments, is a very difficult thing. I think Lloyd Alter is here, who's written a book called the 1.5 ton lifestyle. So, but the figure I found, which is interesting, is this 2000 watts is the continuous use of somebody, that's their personal budget, but it seems to equate to the global average energy use, which at the time of them, it was 17,500 kilowatt hours every year for everything, for your whole life. Each year, it's gone up to about, the global average has gone up to about 20,000 now. So it's quite an interesting model, and it's focused on energy use rather than just a carbon limit. Right, energy use per person. So not surprisingly, energy use per person is very high in the United States, less in Sweden. You might be surprised at Sweden. And then we go down. United Kingdom, energy use per person seems to be quite modest. You'll see how we've achieved that in a minute. But there you can see the world average energy use per person per year. It's around about the 20,000 kilowatt hours per year. Now, what I'm going to be saying is, if we're focusing on space heating, how much does just space heating, just keeping your house warm, how much does that eat out of a carbon budget or an energy budget if you're if you're aiming to try to get down to the global average, which obviously we should be. So, I've had clients come who are burning 40,000 kilowatt hours of gas in a house in Birmingham because it's so badly insulated. They like a warm house and it's quite big. The national average is about 12,000 kilowatt hours of gas at the moment, something of that order. And of course, it will be up and down depending on your income and how frugal you are with the heating. But you're starting to see that these ideas of personal budgets are very challenging if even your space heating is taking such a large bite out of it. So this is really what this is showing is that energy use per person and how it's changed since the 1970s. So it has gone down in the UK. This is the UK. It's gone down at the same time that our population has gone up by 6.5 million people. Now that is interesting. It looks like sort of, wow, aren't we clever? We're decoupling our energy use from our activity. But how have we done that? Well, we've offshored our manufacturing. And 60% of that reduction apparently is related to moving the industry offshore. So we're not accounting for it anymore. We're importing that stuff back and using it and landfilling it and whatever, but we're not accounting for it. So, you know, maybe the story is not quite so, it doesn't reflect quite so well on us. Household energy use appears to have gone down by about 12%, so that's good. Now that's presumably from the 70s. That is, energy efficiency measures are working very, you know, whether that's electrical appliance efficiency measures or heating measures and so on. And until David Cameron did his thing and got rid of the green crap, we were continuing to do, not at great speed, but we were doing energy efficiency on buildings, and it was helping reduce our consumption. It's been counteracted, unfortunately, by more cars on the road, which has, you know, worked against us. 50% more cars on the road. 50% more energy is being used because of cars on the road, and that doesn't include more flights. That's the gas we've been burning. So that goes from 1966, which happens to be when I was born. Was it? Yeah, 1966. And you can see the units up here. You know, we're getting into the terawatt hours now. This is a global, you know, this is planetary size figures, terawatt hours. But you can see, you know, and what we haven't included historically there is town gas and coal, you know, and other heating. So our buildings have been pretty dirty for a long time. And then comes gas, town gas, and then this methane. And you can see that sort of cumulatively building up 390, seems to be have peaked about 396, almost 400 terawatt hours of use in around 2004, is it? And it is reducing. It's reducing, so it's a good thing. If you then start looking at that per person, if you look at that per person, I've obviously included Russia for obvious reasons. It's cold country in the news. Now you can see if you put that gas consumption that you've just seen on the previous slide per person, and think again about this, you know, this energy limit that the Swiss are sort of thinking about, you know, per person, the 17,500 kilowatt hours per year. If our typical average gas consumption per person in the United Kingdom is 11,000, you know, 11,500. You can see again, it's a big chunk out of our what we should be aiming for. And where's that used? Well, in a typical house, that blue area there is the gas that's used for space heating. I don't know what the exact number is, but you know, it's a significant portion, and it shows you why we're concentrating on space heating. Now, moving from gas to electricity. So the current amount of electricity we produce is decarbonising. This is good. This is a good thing that's happening. And you can see here, simple summary on the right there, I've turned it into kilograms of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So this is each unit of electricity produced. How carbon intensive is it? Well, it's reducing because we're adding more renewable generation into the mix. So it is decarbonising. You can see the 2030 target, and that's an interesting. You'll get some context for whether we think we might be reaching that 2030 target or not. Right, now this is one of those rich graphs which I'm going to slightly slow down on so you don't feel overwhelmed. This is Tim built this graph using data that the National Grid sent us and historical data. So the dark grey line top left there, that is measured. That's the measured coefficient, carbon coefficient for electricity. And I'll talk in a minute about why that's slightly less optimistic than the other lines. The other lines are the ideal operation of the National Grid, as imagined under different scenarios. So there are 5 scenarios there, and different parts of government and different organizations use these. How fast is the grid going to decarbonize? They use them in different formats, so it does get a bit confusing. If you look at those bottom 3, lines. Now, this is from the National Grid Future Energy Scenario. So the blue one is called it's a scenario where they're looking at, they call it consumer transformation. The brown one is system transformation. The green one is leading the way. Now, the green one is the one that is the more electrified scenario, where we produce more decarbonized electricity for more heat pumps, for example. Now, we've just kind of can't understand or get our heads around the idea that after 2030, grid electricity will be carbon negative. I mean, we understand what they're saying, you know, by growing biomass that absorbs CO2, then you burn it and then you grow it again. And, you know, these sort of arguments about carbon negative, they have all sorts of weird implications, you know, lots of land use. Where's the land happening? Is it abroad? Is this, you know, is this sort of colonialism again, where we annex bits of land so that we can, you know, sequester carbon and then burn it? We don't accept it, basically. So although we have used the FES3 scenario in this work, we don't accept that this concept, even in practice, it would be very inequitable. We just don't accept it as a thing. I'm sure it can be discussed, but it's an interesting discussion in itself. So again, concentrating with what the National Grid are telling us, how much heat in these different scenarios are they predicting we will have access to for heating our homes? So this is focused on how much heat for the residential sector by 2050. And so you can see with the different scenarios, so you see the 2019 mix, you can see the big blue lump in that bar there, in that column, that's natural gas. The yellow orange is electricity. So in the different scenarios, let's go straight to leading the way in 2050. You can see that they're saying that your heat, we think we can produce about 230 terawatt hours of heat for heating buildings. That's going to come from decarbonized electricity. It's going to come from some hydrogen burnt in hybrid boilers, for example, and then the green one is biofuels and other methods. So a number of different ways of providing heat for us to heat our homes in these different scenarios. And they've had to make some assumptions, and their assumptions are they're doing that in those different scenarios because their technology mix, the number of technologies available for us to use to heat our homes using low carbon energy sources will be a mixture of technologies, and you can see them starting to be listed down the bottom there. So just in terms of heat pumps, you can see the consumer transformation scenario, which gives us 230 terawatt hours of energy. They're imagining 18 million heat pumps will be rolled out by 2050, 18 million heat pumps. And then not a dissimilar amount, 14 million heat pumps in the leading the way scenario. But again, a different sort of scenario with different amounts of energy from different sources. So we asked them, so do you accept that we have to, because you could see that they were reducing the amount of energy available. We've got to get off gas. Gas produces a huge amount of energy. If we've got to get off that to these other sources, potentially it's going to reduce the amount of heat available. So we have to reduce our need for heat in our homes. And we said, what are your assumptions about this? And this is what they sent us some data, and Tim turned it into this graph. The black line again is measured, so it's a historical figure. And then if I just concentrate on the leading the way scenario, which is that green line on this slide, you can see that they're expecting a gradual improvement in the efficiency of homes for heating. Ultimately, around 2050, they're looking for homes to demand, an average home to demand not more than 6,000 kilowatt hours, which is probably about half, about 50% less heat. That's what they're expecting or hoping for. So we've looked at, I'm aware of time, we've modeled a different mix of heating technologies because we've just assumed for the sake of our scenario that hydrogen and natural gas hybrid boilers, air source heat pump boilers, are not going to be significant. We've just concentrated on district heating supply, some direct electric and ground source and air source heat pumps, and gas boilers slowly, well, fairly rapidly, they're diminishing. For our scenario, we've also assumed that for reasons which we could endlessly discuss, I'm not going to, that are sort of typical, we should allow for a conservative coefficient of performance on the heat pumps. So rather than, some properties will get 3 or even 4 with really good teams on them, but we've assumed a 2.4 coefficient of performance. That's 240% efficient. So the question is then, if we, on the right there's an adoption curve that shows the sort of gradual increase in numbers of retrofits, and then it falls off when we finish the job. Now that's just, starting tomorrow sort of thing. If we delay more and we don't start these retrofits, that curve shifts to the right. But what that looks like in terms of the graph on the left, you can see that we're both reducing the number of untreated houses and replacing them with retrofitted houses, but we're also building new homes. So put in the standard assumptions for new homes that are currently floating around, or historical levels, coming out with 200,000 homes per year, whatever the targets were. We put that into the mix, but we've said that all new homes now need to move very rapidly to being low energy homes. So we've said the less demanding AECB low energy building standard, mixed with some passive house homes as well, and that's the purple and the blue line above. So you're adding to the building stock. The building stock is increasing. We've included some demolition as well, but that's what the building stock would look like potentially out to 2050 and so on. So I'm going to flip through these. We took the AECB 3 house types, which we use in various ways to describe the entire stock. And we've taken the typical semi-detached home. It's the most common house type in the UK as part of this exercise. We've set our stock model, the AECB stock model, to England. As I said, we've used the semi-detached model, which has its average. It's a typical shape, and that affects heat loss. Floor area of just under 80 square meters. And what we've said is, okay, so the base case, the unimproved house, what does it look like? It's got a cavity wall, it's got 50 millimeters cavity with some insulation in it. It's not particularly good performance because there's loads of mortar snots and ties, and maybe the insulation's a bit missing in some places. We've said it's got uninsulated suspended timber floors just to make the modeling easier for us, and some solid, some suspended. We've said it's a sort of typical air leakage, so the drafts are about normal, an air leakage of 8 air changes per hour. We said it's got some double glazed plastic windows, solid doors, and the temperature set point on the thermostat in the living room is 20 degrees, but it on average achieves about 17.6 because obviously the house cools down when the heating system is turned off on its timer. And then we said, what happens if you don't go straight to deep retrofit? You rise to the challenge of people who say, just put a heat pump on it. Well, we've looked at just putting a heat pump on it, and it becomes a very expensive thing to do. It also misses some important things that you do need to improve. Ventilation. For health reasons, you need to get ventilation in, and you need to control the costs of running a heat pump. So what we said was, let's try and do the minimal, let's model the minimum amount of measures needed. We're going to assume that the existing radiators can be reused for the heat pump. We said that we will find space for the hot water store in the house. Maybe they had a condensing boiler and they've used the cupboard that they used to contain a tank for something else, but we've said no, you'll find space for it. We've topped up the attic insulation to make sure there's 40 centimeters, 400 mil of insulation there. And then it depends on the house type, what you have to do to reduce the space heat demand to make that heat pump affordable. In this particular case, and this is another interesting conversation, could spin off this, is air tightness. You can make some big energy and comfort wins and health wins by reducing the air tightness, but this is quite challenging, what I've said there. If you don't do that, you'll have to do something else, wall insulation or something like that. We've put some extract ventilation fans in, continuous ventilation, and we're assuming that might be a retrofit you could achieve for 10 or 15,000 pounds. And then we've done an AECB standard deep retrofit where you're doing a little bit more. It doesn't have MVHR. It's not it's not an Enefit level retrofit. It's just a good whole house retrofit, and that could be £50,000 upwards, that sort of retrofit. So what that results in is a heating demand starting from a typical heating demand might be about, for an unimproved house, might be 150 kilowatt hours per square meter each year of that house. If you do that light retrofit with a heat pump, you could bring it down to 100. You can bring the space heat demand down to 126, and then AECB, the retrofit standard says do better than 50 or better, and we've brought this particular model down to just 45. I have to say I'm taking quite a lot of time here. I'm going to skip over a couple of things and get straight to the graph. What we've done here is we've said we've tried. Yeah.
Before you race, you know.
Yeah.
What I'm suggesting is we don't do questions. There's so many questions here. Yeah. Questions. So it's almost going to be meaningless. So if you can finish by about just after 5:02, I think people get the content then, which I think is what we need, and then we'll have in the future. Well, I'll come back to that. But,
yes, okay. I'm sorry about that. I only just finished the presentation. I only got my head around this and got the presentation done at the end of the day. I'll keep going. Okay. So what we're basically looking at here is then, you know, where would you set a limit on this light fabric retrofit with a heat pump? Well, logically, it would be cost parity between gas, which is that £1,038 gas, and moving to electricity and paying the electricity cost. So as long as gas prices increase, you know, proportionally more than electricity, that cost parity should be somewhere around where we've suggested it for this house type. If you move to a deeper retrofit, you start to get into this much lower running cost, but you have to raise the capital and service the capital for that deep cost. But there are benefits that you get from the shallow retrofit and the heat pump. So, you know, you do dramatically cut your greenhouse gas emissions. You can heat your house with them, and you should include the ventilation as well. But such a retrofit would, we think, remain vulnerable to energy price increases. And if the system is commissioned properly, heat pump or the air tightness and so on, a performance gap could mean that occupants couldn't actually heat it as intended, or would experience discomfort. So the performance gap would be very critical. Deeper retrofits, more familiar. All the claims about deeper retrofits: healthier, warmer, more comfortable, more adaptable, because you can sort of afford to heat them longer if you work from home, you're ill with children and so on, working from home much more. Less susceptible to cold weather. And as long as you can afford to do it, there are a lot of benefits. And social housing context, there could be, you know, so what I'm saying is the costs and benefits of retrofit will be very context dependent. So we're just looking at what's this basic, you know, how light could a retrofit be that still makes sense. So to conclude this sequence, then we then looked at whether doing that lighter retrofit with a heat pump would match with the national grid's assumed demand reduction profile here, delivered heat per dwelling. And it does, you know, as part of this exercise, you could argue that the sort of 19 million lighter fabric retrofits with a heat pump, you know, would match with what the national grid is saying, if you go along with trusting the predictions that we will deliver that decarbonised heat in that quantity. Got to put that in. All models are wrong, but some are useful. You know, we use this model to try to answer questions, to think stuff through. We're not saying that what we're saying here is definitively right or wrong, and you shouldn't accept that with any models. Right, so these are the last 3 slides that show the graph that we want to chew over at the next webinar. I've put the blank version up so you can just see what the characteristics of this graph is. So this is up the vertical axis is how many tons per year are emitted from heating this semi-detached house, and also any upfront embodied carbon that comes from doing works on that house. So the first few years there, the purple bars, those are the emissions from gas. carbon dioxide emissions from gas. Then you do a retrofit. You do the light retrofit, and we call it the carbon burp. So the CO2 kicked out by the manufacturing processes and work on site from the heat pump and from some light fabric measures of the orange bit. But then what that does do is it dramatic, because the efficiency of the heat pump, 240% efficient, it reduces demand dramatically. So your electrical heating emissions, because of the decarbonised grid, are both low and increasingly reduce because the grid continues to decarbonise. Then you think, what is the, then there's a second retrofit. There may be some very good reasons why you would do a full retrofit. It involves more measures, more materials, so the upfront emissions are higher. You slash further your operational emissions, carbon emissions, but it's not quite so dramatic as the first time. And then, of course, things need to be renewed. So every 17 years or so, heat pumps are meant to be renewed. So you have to account for that. It's a lifetime carbon accounting process we need to be thinking about. Now, for this one, we followed the RICS guidance, where you use this particular imagined future for the decarbonised electricity. It doesn't go negative with this exercise I'm talking about now. And this is what RICS recommend. So what Tim has done is he's extracted from me what the measures are that we've been modelling, and he attributes embodied carbon figures to those materials. And you can see in the light retrofit and deep retrofit which are the most carbon intensive products being used. Now, this is the one that we'll start with, I think, in the next webinar. And this is many discussions can happen around this. You've got the second graph here on the right. This is the cumulative CO2 emissions that arise from the semi-detached house, from its space heating, leading up to the phase one retrofit, which is the light retrofit. And then it runs, what this is showing is it's running with that light retrofit for 17 years before the heat pump needs replacing. And then at that point, you said, well, what if you did a deeper retrofit? Because there might be lots of reasons why you would do that. And you can see it does increase the emissions over as if you just left it. You just renewed the heat pump and just left it. You didn't do the deeper retrofit. But there are lots of other reasons why very good reasons why you might do a deeper retrofit. So we're definitely not, just to be clear, we're not saying that we want to abandon deep retrofit. We're just separating out how do you get those fast early wins and make an acceptable home for early carbon dioxide reduction wins. And it's context dependent. So there may be reasons why groups of houses will have a lighter retrofit and other groups will go straight for a deeper retrofit. But you can see that it doesn't make a huge difference, even if you do the second retrofit with higher upfront embodied carbon. It's still dramatically different from as if you did nothing and you continue to emit carbon from gas. Clearly an argument for retrofit, whether it's phased or all in one go.